The Nintendo 64 was pretty good, and had fun games on it. Some ones too, but that one is down to Warner Bros. Over the game studio, but that's not the point of this video. The Nintendo 64 had 5 large problems, which in my eyes make it an alright console, but not a good or great one. Let's see how some brilliantly terrible design decisions have made this soon-to-be 30-year-old console what it is today. So, a lot of information I'm getting about the Nintendo 64's issues and hardware come from the Beyond 3D threads of Factify developers talking about the issues they faced while making games for the console, and partly from Kaze Emanuel's Mario 64 code rewrite videos, which also delve into some of the console's internal problems. Problem number 1. The controller. So, the Nintendo 64 controller is famously pretty. You need 3 hands to hold it, there's 6 face buttons, with the C buttons being smaller than the rest, there's no select button, and you can't use the uncomfortable joystick and the mushy D-pad at the same time. But the funniest part is the controller pack, which we'll get into with the second issue the Nintendo 64 had. Problem number 2. The cartridges. We all know the Nintendo 64 used cartridges instead of CDs that the Saturn and PlayStation 1 used. This was a bad idea, and it gets even worse if we consider a few things about the cartridges. So the PlayStation 1 made it so you'd need to have a memory card in order to save your game data. This is because you couldn't write data to the pressed CDs that these consoles use. The Saturn had 32 kilobytes of internal RAM storage, which were kinda like a built-in memory card, along with an external memory card and even a floppy drive, although that one was a Japanese exclusive. While the Nintendo 64's cartridges were smaller, you could at least save data to the cartridge, right? No, not all of them. The Nintendo 64 controllers had these strange memory packs mounted to the bottom of them, like a strange fungal growth. It could be replaced with the Rumble pack, which gave you, well, Rumble along with plugging in a few Game Boy cartridges with that little peripheral to play some Pokemon games and some other sort of stuff. There were quite a few attachments for it. So, while Mario 64 saved to the cartridge, a lot of games like Hot Wheels Turbo Racing would just save to the memory pack, as it was a lot cheaper not to include an internal battery and SRAM in the cartridge. Speaking of the cartridges, they were not fast. Granted, CDs were slower, but the cartridges were way too slow. Actually, it's not that they were slow, it's that the consoles themselves were just too fast, but you get the picture. Code needed to be copied into RAM first and then executed in order to have any form of reasonable performance. This, and you couldn't really stream music from the cartridge like you could with CDs, so in the end you got slightly faster loading times, plus some games didn't need the memory card, and all it cost you is having 10 to 160 times less storage space than your competitors. Considering the console's power in comparison to modern tech, it's a miracle they got Resident Evil 2 running on that thing. It's an inferior version, sure, but just it running while being mostly uncut is miraculous. There's a great modern vintage gamer video that delves into all the pain and suffering the developers had to go through to make it so this game properly releases on the console. I highly suggest you watch it. However, on the horizon there was another memory issue, this time with the RAM. Problem number 3. The latency. The Nintendo 64 used RDRAM. This type of memory was competing with SDR memory. Today, basically everything uses DDR memory, with GPUs and the PS4 using GDDR. However, none use RDRAM. Why is that? I'd like to mention here the early Pentium 4s used RDRAM, however they later realized it was a terrible choice and ended up moving to DDR. Nowadays, getting more than 1GB of RDRAM to use with a Williamette CPU is basically impossible, even though I love it. Not like you'd want a CPU that gets outpaced by its predecessor, but let's get back to the Nintendo 64. While RDRAM had okay bandwidth, although like a tenth of what it was reported to have on the Nintendo 64 was... Even though like a tenth of what it was reported to have on the Nintendo 64 was what you actually got, it struggled in latency. That is, the difference between when the CPU tries to access the RAM and when the RAM responds, be it if it's reading or writing. So overall, the RAM itself was okay at having larger chunks of data moving in and out, but when small variables were changing, like when you'd be, I don't know, playing a video game, there would be a notable performance loss due to the slow access time. I don't have any idea why they went with RDRAM. But the RAM had another issue, that being problem number 4. The Unified Memory Architecture. So the PlayStation 1 had 2 MB of RAM and 1 MB of VRAM. The Saturn had 2 MB of RAM split between faster and slower RAM, 1.5 MB of VRAM, and half a meg of audio RAM. This could be expanded up to 5 more MB with an external upgrade cartridge. The Nintendo 64 had 4 MB of RAM, and that's that. Both the CPU and GPU could use it, and it could even be expanded to 8 MB with an expansion pack. Funnily enough, just like the Nintendo 64 has a jumper pack, the early RDRAM Pentium 4 motherboards came with jumper RAM sticks that carried no RAM but was needed for the system to boot. Considering that both the CPU and GPU can use the entire memory, the architecture was good, right? No! The CPU and GPU, due to this design which is much more primitive than our modern unified systems, although even modern CPUs allocate specific RAM to the GPU instead of just sharing it, fought for resources. And in order to make a proper quality game, you needed to have a careful balancing act, making sure the CPU and GPU were accessing memory at different times in order to prevent clashes and slowdowns. Kaza Emanuel goes deeper into this issue in his Fixing the Entire Super Mario 64 Code video, but there's also another issue that's often talked about both by Kaza and by many others. Have you seen the blurry textures? Problem number 5. The texture cache. VRAM means nothing if your cache is tiny. Imagine textures stored in RAM are like boxes in a warehouse. The texture cache determines how large of a box or how many boxes you can lift at once. At 4 kilobytes, the size is basically nothing, letting us use at most a 90 by 90 texture with 4-bit monochrome pixels. Yes, that means having 4 shades of a single color per texture, but it was most commonly a 48 by 48 texture with 16-bit color. This sucked and resulted in horrifically low quality textures we often see, especially with how the game tries to fix the issue by blurring the pixels, even though a large amount of people, including myself, would prefer to see a pixelated low-resolution texture over a blurry low-resolution texture. This could have been fixed by just making the texture cache larger. There's a lot more issues the console had, most minor, insignificant, or not common enough to talk about. This video was intended to talk about the most common issues the console had faced. These were the most major ones. Now, if you'd excuse me, bonus problem, the 64DD. We all know about the 64 disk drive. It failed for the same reason that the Mega 64 and 32X sold so poorly. In order to buy an upgrade for your console, you already need to own that console. This means that if a new buyer sees a game released for the 64DD and doesn't already own the Nintendo 64, they need to buy both the Nintendo 64 and the 64DD, making it unreasonably priced. Because of that, these kinds of upgrades were only sold to people who had already bought the console and were also interested in essentially buying a second console, which is why the Sega ones sold so poorly and why Nintendo cancelled the 64DD. Overall, there's definitely still more stuff to talk about, but I'm going to leave it up here for now. See you next time.